From 978 to 1016, Æthelred the Unready, also called Æthelred II, ruled as England's king. He is a contentious figure, and his epithet, which is frequently taken to mean poor counsel, we'll explain that a little bit more later, captures the, let's say, complexities of his reign. What complexities? Unrelenting Viking raids, which forced him to pay hefty tributes known as Danegeld in a last-ditch effort to buy peace. His decision-making was also widely criticized for being ill-prepared and reactive. His was a leadership that was generally regarded as representative of the weaknesses of late Anglo-Saxon governance, despite his attempts to preserve stability in the face of both internal conflict and external threats. But what was he really like? Was he really as bad as they paint him to be? Well, maybe within the next hour we can figure it out. Welcome to the channel. It's good to see you. For a little bit more about Anglo-Saxon times. And if that doesn't excite you, I don't know what will. Like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and get comfortable. We're going back to the year 975, when King Edgar unexpectedly breathes his last breath in the month of July, and in the wake of his death, he leaves behind 2 young sons. The elder son, Edward, who would later earn the epithet Edward the Martyr, was described at the time as still a youth on the verge of manhood, and he was considered illegitimate by some. Edgar had married Æthelfrith, the mother of the younger son, Aethelred, in 964. Æthelfrith herself descended from notable lineages. You see, her father was Ordgar, the ealdorman of Devon, and she was also connected to Æthelwold, the ealdorman of East Anglia. Now, I've already done a video, well, a full, I think it goes for about 9 hours or something, of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It goes into quite a bit of detail as a primary source about Æthelwold and Æthelfrith and these characters within this context. If you're interested in that, you can find it in the long videos playlist. Now, depending on precise birth dates, Aethelred could have been only about 10 years old when King Edgar died. It's certainly difficult to be ready by any standard at that age. So, in principle, Edward, being the older of Edgar's 2 surviving sons, would have normally succeeded to the English throne, even though he was young, because primogeniture was typically observed in such successions, as it was in later times, Richard II ascending quite young, and a few others. From memory, perhaps Edward VII, might have been, not sure. Tell me in the comments, correct me. However, chronicles note that he had a disposition inclined towards outbursts and violence, and there was a rumor that held that his intolerable violence of speech and other people's behavior alienated numerous important figures at the court, and this, of course, casts a little bit of doubt on his suitability for kingship. This factor, combined with Edward's suspected illegitimacy, made a faction of English nobles apprehensive about enthroning him. After all, letting such a loose cannon on the throne, you never know what he's going to do. That being said, at a time when there was constant Viking raids, you probably didn't want somebody who was too relaxed. So, in contrast, we have Aethelred, the main character of our talk today, the younger boy, and he was, well, free from the taint of illegitimacy, at least the accusation of illegitimacy, being the child of Edgar's recognised and still living wife. As a result, some of the great men of the realm preferred to advance Aethelred's claiming that his mother's royal marriage offered a more secure basis for succession. Neither Edward nor Aethelred played a direct role in the political power struggles that followed their father's demise. They were both far too young to participate in the factional disputes that arose, which were orchestrated by the influential noblemen and clerics that backed each child. And I say, child. Do remember, yes, we're talking about kings, but we're still talking about very young lads here. Too much pressure. Way too much pressure. Edward's candidacy found strong allies in the ecclesiastical world, notably Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Oswald, the Archbishop of York. Dunstan, by the way, is quite prominent in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle around this time. You'll hear his name come up quite a lot. Powerful secular supporters also rallied to Edward's cause, among them Æthelwine, Ealdorman of East Anglia, and Brythnoth, Ealdorman of Essex. Meanwhile, Æthelfrith, the mother of Æthelred, tirelessly championed her son's bid for the crown. She drew on the support of key figures such as Aelfheir, Ealdorman of Mercia, and Bishop Æthelwald of Winchester, who saw advantages in Æthelred's legitimacy or in promoting the interests of the Queen Dowager. In the end, Edward's supporters proved the more cohesive and compelling faction. By the close of 975, he had triumphed over his half-brother in the contest for succession. Edward was duly crowned as the king at Kingston upon Thames, securing the throne for himself, despite all of those lingering questions regarding his temperament and, of course, the illegitimacy accusations, but, well, I doubt no one will be talking too much about them once he's actually on the throne, especially with that temper of his. Meanwhile, young Aethelred, though not chosen to be king at this juncture, remained an ever-present figure at court, a prince who, in time, would also inherit his father's crown under dramatic circumstance. How dramatic? Well, you see, poor old Edward's reign only lasted 3 years, because he was assassinated, reportedly by members of his younger brother's household at Corfe Castle in March of 978. Although detailed records of Edward's time on the throne are pretty scarce, surviving accounts do emphasize the political turbulence that marked his brief rule. One significant source of upheaval dated back to the sweeping monastic reforms championed under King Edgar, which had included excessive grants of land to religious communities in line with the new Benedictine ideals. These reforms disrupted the traditional aristocratic networks of patronage, as lands and revenues that had once belonged to lay noble families were then diverted to the church. By the end of Edward's strict rule, however, many aristocrats had already begun reclaiming or seizing properties, directly challenging the privileges of monastic houses that had gained under Edgar. Archbishop Dunstan, a principal architect of these new ecclesiastical reforms, opposed the reappropriation of monastic lands, but the conflict was not purely a matter of religious doctrine. You see, influential backers of both Edward and his half-brother Aethelred included individuals devoted to church reform. Their support or rejection of monastic privileges was often shaped by immediate concerns over local power structures and land ownership. Despite the turmoil, Edward seems to have enjoyed solid backing within many monasteries, and that's hardly surprising. given that monastic chroniclers were the ones who recorded the reactions to his murder. Well, it was these same religious writers who documented Edward's final days and the shock that reverberated through the country when he was killed on the very estate belonging to his younger sibling. Yet, at the start of Aethelred's reign, there was no widespread expectation of doom or failure among the king's new council. Contemporary sources suggest that his coronation stirred optimism. One chronicler noted that English noblemen celebrated the event. Well, Britfirth of Ramsey wrote of great joy at Aethelred's consecration by Archbishops Dunstan and Oswald. The king himself is depicted as strikingly youthful and elegant. Well, of course, have to paint him in his best angles, I'm sure. But in reality, Aethelred was likely still just a boy, somewhere between 9 and 12 years old, when he came to the throne. Now, of course, times were different, and when you have a lifespan of about, life expectancy of 25, you've got to grow up a little bit quicker, but still quite a young lad. Given his inexperience, of course, the day-to-day running of the realm initially fell to leading figures such as Bishop Æthelwold of Winchester, Queen Æthelfrith, and Archbishop Dunstan. Among these influential patrons, Æthelwold stood out for his authority. He continued championing monastic reform, but also exercised substantial sway over the royal court. When he died in August the 1st of 984, Æthelred began to rule without the balance of that council, and soon he ventured into policies that involved encroaching on church rights. Of course, this was an approach that he would later regret. Writing in 993, he lamented Æthelwold's absence, remarking that the bishop's death deprived both my interest, as he put it, in the entire kingdom of a tireless pastor and statesman. But nevertheless, Queen Æthelfrith's influence was rekindled in the 990s when she assumed responsibility for raising Æthelred's heirs, and her brother Ordulf emerged as one of the king's most trusted and closest advisors. Thus, she remained a significant figure until her death, sometime between 1000 and 1002, we're not quite sure. Her renewed status underlined the fluid nature of power at court, where familial ties and royal favor frequently shaped the events. By the end of the decade, the realm had settled into a new equilibrium. The whispers of unrest were of course never far away, under a still young king who, for better or worse, would be remembered by posterity as unready. So, during the reign of this unready king, as they put it, England experienced rather noticeable growth in population. And not just that, but also trade and a general air of prosperity. Despite the persistent threat of Danish incursions, we'll get to them, this era had followed a time of relative peace under King Edgar, Æthelred's father, who had effectively reasserted English control over the Danelaw in the mid-10th century, bringing the kingdom a brief respite from Viking aggression. But this calm, this break in hostilities, did not survive into the latter years of the century. Beginning in 980, when Æthelred could have been no older than 14, groups of Danish adventurers, we'll call them, launched a series of raids on the English coastal settlements, striking first at Hampshire, Thanet, and Cheshire in that same year, then Devon and Cornwall in 981, and finally, in 982, they hit Dorset. Though sporadic and initially limited in scale, these attacks were unsettling reminders that the Danes, while they'd been bargained with, were not going to go away quietly, and they still posed a genuine danger to England's shores. In 988, another raid affected the southwest region, and a recorded battle was waged between the invaders and local Devon forces. While these sporadic assaults did not inflict permanent damage on England's political or military structure, historians do argue that they hold significant importance for introducing England to diplomatic relations with Normandy. So, during this period, Danish attackers occasionally found refuge among the Normans, creating growing tensions between the English and Norman courts. Of course, the English kind of saw it as harboring criminals. War criminals, I suppose. This matter drew the attention of the current Pope, John the 15th, who, determined to resolve the animosity, intervened to help broker an accord. And, are you surprised? His efforts succeeded, and a peace agreement was actually endorsed at Rouen in 991, representing an international attempt to reduce friction and forestall further hostilities. Nevertheless, Danish aggression continued to mount in the early 990s, culminating in especially severe campaigns in 1006 and 1007, and again from 1009 to 1012. Aethelred attempted to stave off the raiders by paying large sums of tribute, often referred to as the Danegeld, but these payments failed to deter Danish ambitions for long. Adding to the difficulty, the English forces during Aethelred's reign primarily relied on infantry, reinforced by mercenaries from overseas rather than developing a robust native cavalry. The Danes, well versed in swift attacks and flexible maneuvers, exploited this vulnerability. One of the pivotal moments of this escalating conflict came in August 991, and we gotta rewind it back a little bit. A Danish fleet of considerable size began a campaign along the southeastern coastline, landing first at Folkestone in Kent, before making its way around the coast, moving up the river Blackwater and ultimately occupying Northey Island near Malden in Essex. Byrhtnoth, the ealdorman of Essex, had stationed himself and a revenue of thanes at Malden, which lies roughly a mile or two west of Northey. What ensued was a fierce confrontation, remembered today through the Battle of Malden, an old English poem that commemorates Byrhtnoth's gallant yet ultimately futile stand against the overwhelming forces of the Danes. This clash proved to be the first in a series of devastating defeats for the English, who would face not only smaller bands of Danish raiders, but also far more organized Danish armies. Even as England's economic and demographic fortunes flourished under Aethelred, these military losses left a lasting impact on the realm's stability, foreshadowing further struggles in the decades to come. Now, the Danes, entrenched on Northey Island and getting nice and comfortable there too, were constrained by a single tidal causeway that linked their position to the mainland at Malden. This causeway was submerged at high tide, making it impassable during certain hours. By the time the Danes prepared to leave their camp on the island, Byrhtnoth and his combined force of personal retainers and local militia had seized control of the landward end of the causeway. As the tide rose, Danish envoys shouted across the water, demanding the tribute they believed England owed. Byrhtnoth staunchly refused to yield, and his men waited in orderly ranks along the banks for the waters to recede. Once the tide ebbed, the Danes began pushing across the now exposed path. only to be halted by 3 of Byrhtnoth's stalwarts who, for a time, held the crossing single-handedly. It was then that the Danes requested free passage onto the mainland to meet the English on equal ground, a challenge Byrhtnoth accepted, with what his admirers themselves branded over-courage. Seizing the opportunity, the Danes rushed through the falling tide and engaged Byrhtnoth's men in fierce battle. The conflict's outcome was sealed when Byrhtnoth fell. It's hard to come back after the general dies, of course. Too much of a hit on morale. And of course his death did exactly that, effectively shattering the English will to fight. Many of his followers fled, and the defense line soon collapsed. Nonetheless, a group of Byrhtnoth's thanes, fully aware that hope was lost, still refused to retreat. In a final act of loyalty, they determined to fight on to the end, sacrificing their lives to avenge the death of their lord and go out like men. It is the memory of this heroic stand that is famously preserved in the poem The Battle of Maldon, written in Old English, that lends the encounter its lasting renown. Well, after Maldon, the English leadership resolved to appease the Danes by granting them the tribute they had demanded, paid in the hope of securing a fragile peace. Yet, despite a costly gesture, the Danish fleet responsible for Byrhtnoth's defeat continued to scourge the coastline between 991 and 993. Their numbers evidently increased during this period, and by 994 they sailed up the Thames estuary in a significantly larger force, pressing all the way to London. No conclusive outcome of this fresh assault has been recorded, unfortunately, leaving both sides exhausted but with neither gaining a clear advantage. Around this juncture, King Aethelred sought out the Danish fleet leaders to negotiate a precarious truce. It's kind of difficult to negotiate with Vikings. Well, the king's government and the Danes, who were already operating several bases in England, concluded a treaty defining how trade, property disputes, and other legal matters would be regulated. Now, crucially, it concluded with a pledge that a further payment of £22,000 in gold and silver had been given to the Danes as a fresh purchase of peace, while also stipulating that the ravages of the previous year would be completely forgiven. In tandem with these events, Olaf Tryggvason, by then a baptized Norwegian prince, was confirmed as a Christian in a ceremony at Andover in 994, with Æthelred himself serving as his sponsor. Welcome to the faith, Olaf. So Olaf accepted lavish gifts, and he swore, right in front of God, to never invade England. True to that vow, he did not return in hostility. However, it appears that other Viking contingents stayed behind under the newly made arrangements, presumably taking up mercenary service in Æthelred's pay, with a likely headquarters on the Isle of Wight. Thus, even as Olaf's departure provided a momentary respite, remnants of the Danish force remained woven into the fabric of the kingdom's defense and economy, an uneasy legacy of these diplomatic dealings. In 997, Danish raiders once again descended upon England, this time with renewed determination. They targeted Cornwall and Devon, as well as parts of western Somerset and South Wales, inflicting a series of localized attacks that proved difficult to repel. The following year, in 998, the same force pressed on, laying waste to Hampshire, Sussex, and Dorset. But there is no evidence, according to some modern historians, to suggest that these raiders constituted a fresh army. It rather appears to have been the very mercenary fleet that had allied with King Aethelred's court in 994, only to turn against those it had been commissioned to protect. Well, after harassing Kent in 999, the Danes sailed away to Normandy in 1000, likely prompted by English reluctance to produce another round of gaffol, that tribute that would later be widely referred to as Danegeld or Dane payment. The departure in 1000 gave King Æthelred a fleeting respite, during which he embarked on a campaign of devastation in Strathclyde. The precise motivation for this northern venture is unknown, lost in obscurity of the era's records. But the brief lull allowed the king to regroup and make a new plan. By 1001, the Danish fleet, possibly the same one that had just departed, returned to England and proceeded to ravage the area of West Sussex. During their raids, the Danes often retired to a stronghold on the Isle of Wight, from which they could launch further assaults at a moment's notice. But in the south of Devon, the city of Exeter successfully resisted their attempts. Yet it became clear that King Aethelred struggled to contain these incursions. Come the spring of 1002, England once more paid a substantial sum of tribute, this time amounting to 24,000 to secure a truce. Modern commentators frequently criticize Aethelred's repeated reliance on massive Danegeld payments as a sign of short-sightedness or weakness in his governance. But there are others that can observe that paying off marauders had been recognized policy for at least a century, and it wasn't just him doing it. Think of Alfred the Great, Charles the Bold, many people before Aethelred. So don't think it was his idea to just start throwing money at the problem. It was quite established. Well, while extortionate and undeniably onerous, such payments might still have seemed the most expedient way to spare local communities from further destruction and loss of life. A short-term solution, sure, but it's still a solution. Now, on November 13th, 1002, Æthelred ordered the infamous massacre of all Danish men in England. Among the victims was said to be Gunhild, the sister of Denmark's King Sweyn Forkbeard. Her death apparently fueled Sweyn's resolve for vengeance, prompting him to initiate a new wave of incursions. Arriving in East Anglia in 1004, he first sacked Norwich, before confronting Ulfketil Snilgener, an influential East Anglian noble. Although Ulfketil ultimately suffered defeat, his determined resistance, especially near Thetford, significantly damaged the Danish host and almost trapped their ships. Now, this proved that the English defenders could still strike formidable blows. They just needed to be ably led by someone who was perhaps ready. In 1005, Sweyn's army withdrew to Denmark, possibly urged on by the severe famine affecting both the British Isles and the continent, and perhaps also influenced by the losses inflicted upon it in East Anglia. Early in 1007, the English agreed upon yet another massive tribute payment, £36,000, to buy themselves at least 2 years of relative safety. During this breathing space, a new national fleet of warships was assembled in 1008, presumably with the intention of mounting a far more cohesive defense. This plan, however, suffered a setback when one of its commanders turned into a pirate. It's a dramatic career change, throwing the king's councillors into doubt about deploying the fleet en masse. Before long, in 1009, formidable Danish forces arrived under Thorkel the Tall and his brother Hemming, representing the most daunting Viking threat that England had faced since Aethelred's accession. The campaigns from 1009 to 1012 would effectively decide the fate of England for the next generation. The English defensive effort, beset by internal divisions and weakened morale, soon crumbled under the relentless and brutal raids. In April 1012, the marauders were finally bought off for a staggering £48,000, another vast sum that showed England's desperate attempts to hold back a tide of devastation. Over the next years, these recurring payments and the repeated breakdowns in the English defence would leave a deep mark on both the monarchy and the kingdom's governance, and definitely a foreshadowing of the further turmoil that lay ahead. Things were going to get worse before they got better. Well, if they ever got better. And so, by 1013, King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark embarked on a determined invasion. Not just a raid. This time, he was after the crown. With English resistance gradually collapsing, he succeeded in forcing King Aethelred into exile in Normandy by late that year. But the situation dramatically changed again when Sweyn suddenly died on February 3rd, 1014. Upon his death, the Danish fleet stationed along the Trent immediately transferred their allegiance to his son, Cnut the Great. However, many leading English nobles decided to invite Aethelred back from Normandy, provided he would agree on certain conditions. They insisted upon his swearing an oath to remedy the grievances for which they blamed him, as well as granting a general pardon for anything said or done against him previously, and I'm sure there was a lot said against him. The list must have been quite long. Well, this arrangement, a conditional restoration of a reigning monarch, represents one of the earliest known contracts between a king and his subjects. It also suggests that numerous English lords had submitted to Sweyn in the first place out of pure distrust for Aethelred. No respect. Well, either way, restored under these terms, Aethelred mustered an army to drive out Cnut and his Danish supporters. At this stage, Cnut's only real support in England lay in the kingdom of Lindsey, that is around the modern-day North Lincolnshire, or thereabouts. According to the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, this is quite old, by the way, it's not modern, Aethelred received assistance from the Norwegian Olaf Haraldsson, who repeatedly led a flotilla of ships in a successful assault on London Bridge. Thereafter, Olaf helped Aethelred recover the capital and various parts of the country from Danish control. In April of 1014, facing increased opposition, Cnut decided it was best to withdraw from England, leaving his allies in Lindsey to suffer Aethelred's reprisals, and suffer they did. Olaf departed in 1016 to undertake raids in Western Europe, leaving the situation in England unresolved. But later that same year, Cnut returned to England in turmoil. Edmund Ironside, one of Aethelred's sons, had grown estranged from his father and was based in the north, where he found ready backing among the local people embittered by the devastation previously inflicted on Lindsey. Cnut seized much of England during the ensuing unrest, and when Aethelred died on April the 23rd, 1016, Edmund joined forces with the Londoners to defend the city. The two sides met at the Battle of Assendun on October 18th, 1016. Edmund's forces were decisively defeated by Cnut, despite Edmund's renowned prowess in battle. Obviously, he wasn't that good. Oh. Seeking to avoid total chaos, Cnut and Edmund agreed to a division of the kingdom. Edmund would rule Wessex, while Cnut would command everything else on the Thames' far side. Not a bad deal, I suppose, considering the circumstance. But just weeks later, on November 30th, Edmund Ironside died, and Cnut took full possession of England's crown. That's very convenient. As for Aethelred, he was buried at Old St. Paul's Cathedral in London. But sadly, both the tomb and its accompanying monument were destroyed in 1666 during the Great Fire of London, leaving no visible memorial of Aethelred's final resting place. If you watch my video about the Great Fire of London, you'll know how much we really lost. Not good at all. A plaque in the crypt of the present-day St. Paul's commemorates him along with those whose graves were lost in the devastation. At least we got something. Now, let's have a little look back on Aethelred before we go. Certainly an interesting life. Certainly took a bit of a beating. I suppose it was more about the state of England and how he was just a king at a very difficult time. I think that most people would have had a very hard time dealing with the problems that England had. Well, either way, we know what happened in 1066. The Anglo-Saxons unfortunately got wiped out. It's sad. Well, as for Aethelred, he presided over a government that produced a substantial body of legislation, and he is said to have ruthlessly enforced any of the laws that had passed. Surviving records preserve at least 6 of these legal codes, which address a wide variety of topics and offer insight into the governance of the period. It's a little bit dry, but hey, you gotta have something. Notably, the eminent preacher and writer Wulfstan II, Archbishop of York, played a central role in the royal council, often referred to as the Witan, and was likely responsible for drafting at least 3 latest codes from Aethelred's reign. These codes place particular emphasis on ecclesiastical matters, mirroring Wulfstan's own interests, and they also reflect his characteristically forceful rhetorical style. Significantly, Wulfstan went on to compose legal codes for King Cnut himself, reusing several of the principles and statutes first laid down during Aethelred's rule. Just change it up a little bit. Though his government ultimately failed to repel the Danish onslaught, there were still notable institutional successes under Aethelred. Can't throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet. Chief among these was a marked improvement in the quality of coinage, bolstered by a series of wide-reaching coinage reform laws. Since the standard of currency can be seen as an indirect measure of economic health, the enhanced uniformity and craftsmanship of Aethelred's silver pennies point to considerable progress in the monetary system of the realm. And it might sound boring, but think about how important the economy is, economic matters, and actually producing a fiat currency that can be traded throughout the realm. It's not like going and winning big battles and conquering far-off lands. But think of what you'd want from a great ruler in our modern age. The economy is always number one, right? So let's think about it like that. But of course, despite all these achievements, posterity has not judged Aethelred kindly. And there's been a number of apocryphal tales and myths over the centuries, attempting to account for his perceived failures by exaggerating both his personal quirks and his missteps. There is one such story, among the many, recorded by the 12th century historian William of Malmesbury, and it claims that St. Dunstan foresaw the downfall of the English monarchy during Aethelred's lifetime, allegedly because, according to his tale, Aethelred had fouled the baptismal font as an infant. I mean, maybe. There is a strikingly similar legend circulated about the Byzantine Emperor Constantine Copronymus, another monarch widely disliked by certain factions, and that indicates that these stories may have been nothing more than fabrications intended to discredit unpopular rulers, very easy to do after they pass away. But you see, since our modern times, concerted efforts to revisit Aethelred's reputation have gained quite a bit of momentum, especially with one Simon Keynes, who contends that many of our enduring negative impressions stem from retrospective or embellished narratives that really cast events from Aethelred's lengthy reign in the light of an ultimate English defeat. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, vital source for this era's history that I mentioned before, prominently features among these accounts, because it sometimes describes events from a vantage point 15 years or more after they occurred. It often portrays the ruinous end as inevitable, colouring the depiction of Aethelred's policies and decisions with a fatalistic sense of hindsight. This retrospective lens, as Keynes argues, has been long obscured a more balanced view of the king and his achievements, all these complexities going completely unnoticed. But of course, we're all inevitably constrained by the limited sources available for Aethelred's reign, which means we just have to rely on whatever evidence survives and take it as it comes. This dependence, of course, has led scholars to emphasize the potential pitfalls that arise when trying to reconstruct the life of a king who's long been dismissed in popular opinion. Modern, more careful assessments of Aethelred's rule, rather than supporting the long-held perception of his alleged incompetence, frequently provide grounds for questioning that later notoriety. Indeed, many historians now judge Aethelred's personal character quite less harshly, I should say, pointing out that any monarch of the era would have struggled amidst such formidable circumstances. It could have been Edward the Unready. It could have been Peter the Unready. It could have been anybody. No one was really ready for that England that Aethelred inherited. But even so, the failings of Aethelred's government have forever placed his reign in the shadow of those of Edgar, Aethelstan, and Alfred, but they are certainly hard acts to follow, especially Alfred with the epithet the Great. You don't get that for nothing. Well, in terms of appearance, we don't really have any contemporary descriptions of Aethelred that have survived. Nevertheless, John of Worcester, writing in the 12th century, calls him elegant in his manners, handsome in visage, glorious in appearance. Not a bad assessment. Interestingly, the 13th century Icelandic text, Gunnlaug's Saga, the author Stungu credits Aethelred with being a good prince, a generous prize, and a war-swift king. Now that sounds pretty positive, don't you think? Well, before concluding, it's briefly worth mentioning the meaning behind Aethelred's name a little more. Now, like the compound names common with the royal house of Wessex, Aethelred joins two Old English elements, that being Ædel, being noble, and red, council. So noble, council. Alliterating with the other names such as Æthelwulf, noble wolf, Aethelred, elf council, Edward, rich protection, and Edgar, rich spear. Now this infamous epithet, unræd, is often rendered in modern English as the unready, although a more literal translation of the Old English noun unræd might be ill-advised or bad plan or folly. The word red, which can also mean counsel or advice, is the same element found in Aethelred's own name. So consequently, Æthelred the Unready becomes kind of an oxymoron. Noble counsel, no counsel. Some have suggested translating it more precisely as Æthelred the Ill-Advised, and I tend to agree with them. After all, he was young to the throne. He should have had advisors, right? Notably, since the nickname does not actually appear until the 1180s, and that's over a century after Æthelred's death, it's unlikely to represent how contemporaries or those close to him really viewed his reign. Of course, I suppose that we'll never really know. But what do you think? Was he really unready? Were you ready for this video? I've been ready to make it for a while, to be honest. I'm glad I did. It's complicated when we look back 1,000 years ago and try to judge how someone behaved in certain circumstance. But perhaps look at yourselves and think, how would I have dealt with this situation? How would you really dealt with the Danes? And then think about later on with, I don't know, poor old Harold Godwinson, who had to fight those invaders in the north and then come all the way down to fight in the Battle of Hastings. No one is really blaming Harold Godwinson for the end of Anglo-Saxon England. I don't hear that very much. But a lot of blame is put on poor old Aethelred, or perhaps poor young Aethelred. Well, I think that I'm ready to end the video now. Perhaps you're ready for a bit of a rest. But I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Doug, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, and Kevin. Thank you very much. All right, and I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, everyone, and as always, you know I say it, lots of love to you all.